ahead and get started since this is our session time. So, our topic today is really exciting, service level agreements. I know you guys can't wait, right? We can't either. So, see our next screen. My name is Hali Reyes, and I'm the Executive Director for a large-scale IT project in North America. It's called CalWin. I lead an 18-county consortium that delivers welfare services to more than 4 million clients a month. We have Medi-Cal, CalFresh, CalWorks, and other assorted programs. We also interface with the new CalHears system. I'm here today because I can lend the customer's perspective on what you would expect to receive from a vendor throughout the life of a contract. So I'll be talking a lot about my experiences with a current contract procurement that we just initiated on August 1st. I have 30 years of experience in the public sector, working on large-scale IT projects, like many of you, working my way through the ranks, all the way from project management or components of project management through project management and on up into the executive leadership role. I couldn't have picked a better career for myself. And it was very profound this morning. I heard twice that you need a sociology degree to be an effective project leader, because you do have to understand people. People is one of the biggest aspects of the work that we do. It's not the functions of the work that we do, but really how we interact and relate to individuals that we work with on a daily basis. How do you get more out of somebody when they're fully tapped? These are the skills that we need to hone and work on over the years. When my contract is fully executed, it's worth $500 million. And when I say fully executed, it's a 5-year with 5-year potential extensions. So that's the current contract that we just entered on August 1st. I'm going to turn it over to Frank.
So my name is Frank Otto. Am I coming through okay on this? So I can bring the vendor perspective. So I have certainly been and won a lot of different business over the years, bringing IT services to state and local government clients. About 15 years ago, I started another company, NexLevel, with a business partner, and so now we bring project management services to state and local clients, and we kind of help them manage these kinds of projects, right? Because it can be so large, so difficult, and we really understand the vendor perspective. So I am a managing principal in NexLevel. You know, I think I put more than 25 years state and local. Certainly more experience than that. You can tell by the gray hair. And what I do is help clients a lot with SLAs, right? Whether in the procurement side of it, in the management side of it. And so I think together, Hali and I can actually bring a nice perspective to it. And hopefully we're going to come away with some, as I said, actionable information.
Right, and I think throughout this session, I mean, clearly this is a smaller group of people. We can ask each other's questions and try and figure out, you know, how this can be applied in your environment. I invite you to call me anytime or come and see my project, spend some time with me. I've learned through the School of Hard Knocks, like many of you have, I would assume. And I want to help share that with you so that you don't have to duplicate any of the problems that we've had in past contracts. So we can go to the next slide. So today we're going to talk about which types of projects really require SLAs. Not all projects require, you know, a litany of SLAs. How do you develop them? Once you have them, what do you do with them? And then really, how do you apply those SLAs throughout the life of the contract? So it's just kind of a historical look at why you have them. What do you do with them when you have them? And when you really need them, how do you apply them? So that's what we're going to spend our time on.
As it says here, the Q&A, but we're open to questions anytime, so feel free.
Yeah, it would be easier with a group of this size. If you've got a question, just ask it. instead of waiting till the end. So Frank and I came up with a high level, what we thought was a decent definition of what an SLA is. It's really a contract obligation that defines what you expect from your vendor, how you manage it, and how those things are applied. It's that straightforward. But SLAs are nothing but complicated when you try to apply them, which is where we're going to spend our time today, is talking our way through that.
Okay, so the question is, when do you need SLAs? Large custom service contracts. So for an example, if you have a contract where, as a state or local government entity that you're hiring a vendor who's managing the hardware, maybe they brought in the hardware, it still may be yours after you purchase, but by the same token, let's say they sized it, right? So they've sized the hardware, and then you want to make sure that your system performs, so you would have service level agreements associated with that, so that they, obviously you could save a lot of money if you undersize somebody's hardware, or if they're writing an application for you and the application doesn't perform the way it should, right? So you want to have the ability to hold them to certain standards when it's a large custom service contract. So a couple examples: the Hali's contract, the CalWin. I just threw a couple up there that I've worked on over the years. Department of Fish and Wildlife has a statewide automated license data system. Thousands of places that sell them, millions of licenses per year. That was a fully custom written system. So, and the vendor manages it long term. So they need the SLAs to make sure that, and there's a call center component to it also. So you make sure that the vendor performs the way it should. The Highway Patrol, there's a dispatch system in 25 locations that train thousands of users all across the state. It needs extreme uptime because it's a dispatch system associated with 911, right? So, just examples of the types of contracts that you need SLAs on. And not to be confused with some of the other types of SLAs that are out there. Cloud providers always give you SLAs, right? So, and they're good SLAs. They're just not negotiable and they're not custom. So what we're going to focus on today is this instance where you have a service delivery and you need some SLAs that are custom to make sure that the vendor can perform the way you're paying them to perform. Telecom providers, the same thing. I went to the Microsoft site and looked up Azure. Lots and lots of SLAs. None of which are custom, and they all are, what they control solely. So that's good, but what we're looking at is something probably a little more customized, a little more comprehensive.
Right, and you'll note. Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
So what do you do when your vendor is another state agency that you can't hold their feet to their fire?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have a good answer to that, other than just really a response is there isn't anything you can't overcome through direct, honest, transparent communication. So if you get the issues out on the table, what are your problems, and you come to the table with solution in mind, you can pretty much solve any problem. I mean, that's the typical project management skill that they teach all of us. Communication is key. There isn't anything magical about what we're going to talk about today, other than you have to be very clear about what you want. You have to be able to take those risks to say what your problems are, because exposing the past problems really define future SLAs, right? So, where you've struggled in the past is what you want to solve for your future. So that's the only response that I could have to that question. I don't know if you have anything, Frank.
Yeah, just a little bit to add. So when you're in the same organization, right? So SLAs are typically a contractual obligation with you and an outside entity. When you're in the same organization, often they're called OLAs, operational level agreements. One of the main differences is you don't have the consequence of a liquidated damage. So, but it still makes good sense to write them up. And have everybody abide by them, right? Because it gives you something to review, I would go through the same process that we're going to talk about, which is, get these things set up and review them monthly so that everyone can understand the level of service that you're expecting and the level of service that they're providing. I can tell you also, I have another example in a situation. This after this system was put in, the Highway Patrol system, a couple years later, the Department of Parks and Rec came on the same system. So that's an instance where there's an IAA, an interagency agreement between the two organizations. So the one is the customer of the other. But what we did to give them some of the same teeth was to say, to some extent, the contract of the Highway Patrol to the vendor is the same SLAs that they will provide then downward to the, more of a pass-through, not downward. Let's don't say flow down. Let's say pass-through, right? Because obviously the one agency cannot be beholden to the other for that sort of a damage. But by the same token, they get the same uptime, response time, and everything else, and at their sites it's measured the same way.
Okay, so at the very highest level, defining SLAs really just defines what you expect from your vendor. We do that in the contract or in the RFP process. I would assume that many of your contracts that you're managing are done much the same way. It defines what you're doing. It delineates who's responsible for what. So if you have a really well-written SLA, you'll know exactly who's measuring what and when. And then really the term penalty you'll find in contract negotiations is no sale. You don't get to say penalty because they really are liquidated damages. Sometimes the outcome of a poorly performing system where they miss an SLA, it's hard to quantify really how you were damaged. So you define your liquidated damages up front by using scenario-based exercises to put a damage amount to that. And that's what we've done in our project. And we'll get into the details of how we've done that later on in the program.
Yeah.
Anything to add to that?
Well, just the fact that just the re-emphasis, it is a damage, not a penalty. You know, and that's a big difference. That you've agreed upon because, and I'm not a lawyer, but what they tell me is that it's because it's what you've both agreed is almost incalculable based upon how difficult it would be, and so you've agreed upon this as this is what we're going to pay as the damage.
Yep. Exactly.
Whereas a penalty is imposed.
A penalty is imposed, and a liquidated damage is a process that's predefined.
Right.
And if the event occurs, y'all know what it's going to look like. So this is where I start talking about my pearls of wisdom. So in the project that I'm on, we just exited a 15-year contract with Hewlett-Packard Enterprises, and we re-procured through the RFP process. The short-sightedness of the initial RFP and set of SLAs was very apparent once we entered M&O after the development cycle. So when you're going into one of these highly complex proprietary systems where you're developing all this stuff that needs to be done, you're really focusing on your requirements, and you're focusing on, by God, they better build it and build it the way we want it. But don't forget to build your M&O SLAs. We did. We had 7 SLAs. They had very little consequence to our vendor. Therefore, we had poor performance in key M&O areas. What I also want to emphasize is don't try and wing it or do it on your own. Leverage what other people have done. Call me. Call me. I've been through this cycle 3 times now. I know how to write a tight SLA. I'm happy to give you everything we have, including the process, the reporting, everything that we've done over the years. Don't do it yourself. It's just waste time. And then you have to learn the same things that I had to learn. In terms of a re-procurement, which is where a vendor takes over your project for M&O services only, we now have 17 SLAs. And we have so many more SLAs, plus we bolstered up the ones that weren't so good in the first go-round. The purpose of that is all those key painful areas that we couldn't seem to kind of navigate and get through and get the service we expected. The vendor would just say, well, this is what you signed up for. We put in our SLAs in this second part to the contract. Frank's going to talk a little bit about what that does for a vendor bidding on an RFP. So when you put in a lot of teeth in the contract, your vendor is going to respond accordingly with their submission to that RFP, their response. Because they have to build in a level of risk that they're assuming based on the SLAs that you're building into your RFP requirements.
Yeah, so as a vendor bidding on large contracts, you look at the whole thing and you say, okay, so they want 99% uptime, I can do that. And I want this, and I look at one every once in a while, I go, oh my goodness, there's nothing we could ever do to achieve that. We cannot buy enough hardware in the world to achieve that, or we could not staff enough people in the world to answer, every phone call guaranteed within 2 seconds, right? There would be a limitless number of staff. If the SLAs are too high, if they are too stringent, as a vendor, you just cost it in. You cost it in as you look at what the penalty would be, and you'd say, I can't achieve that. And so you work with the bidding people, and you work with the, internally on the vendor side, these are all discussions that go on, is, so, if I'm the person who's going to do the operations later, you say, I can't meet that. And so then you work with the costing folks, and you cost in whatever is the damage associated with that. So so there's a balance. SLAs have to be a balance, right? You want them to work. You want everybody's purpose is aligned, which is as the purchaser, as the buyer, you want to get the services you need, and as a vendor, we want to provide those services, right? Because everybody wants to have a happy, useful, productive relationship and a system, and everyone wants to be successful. And so what you want to do is make your SLAs reasonable, something that is obtainable, and that are useful to holding their feet to the fire. Does that make sense?
In our contract negotiations for the re-procurement, we spent several months in negotiations, and a large portion of that was to talk about our SLAs and really defining what our expectations were, and then the vendor having an opportunity to say what that meant to them and what their corresponding response would be. What you don't want to do, and we'll talk more a bit later, is you don't want to set yourself up for an adversarial kind of conversation or an environment that you're going into, because really at the end of the day what you want is you want your system to work. You want it to work the way you want it, expect it to work. You really don't want to apply LDs. It's not a money-making business. It's not a proposition for, adding money to your change budget. It could be. If they're not executing to your expectations, but in a perfect world, applying LDs, once a year would be optimal, and that's what you strive for.
What's an LD?
Liquidated damage. I'm sorry. Thank you for asking.
So I have a question. So because the service level agreements are, so closely tied to how much you actually ultimately pay for the for the system that you're trying to build. What's your experience? Are there service level agreements that are like ambiguous? Do you find that like people don't really adequately define what they want in a service level agreement, and does that impact the cost of the project?
So from a vendor standpoint, I love it if it's ambiguous, right?
And they don't want to call it to our attention. And that's how our first contract was. I mean, because we interpreted the words on paper very differently than our vendor did. And when that happens, and it will, if you don't go through all the rigor of definition and scenario-based running those through, then you end up in very contentious mode and in meetings where you can't come to an agreement on what something really meant. So this is where you're going to spend a lot of time. It's kind of a dry topic. Make sure you surround yourself with the smartest people in your organization to help you define these SLAs.
Does that answer your question?
Okay. So for the CalWin contract, we did a pretty good job in defining what our expectations were. We had a whole SLA section, clearly. But we went through a series of figuring out what each of the SLAs meant to us. Our vendor had an opportunity to say what it meant to them. And then we answered any questions as we exited out a contract before ink was on paper. But after that, you need to really sit down and figure out what your process is to fully define them. So each of the 17 SLAs, we worked our way through to say, okay, what does this mean? What would the LD mean? What would the LD be if XY happened? And how would that look in terms of an LD? And you go through that level of rigor for each and every one of them. Some of them are pretty straightforward. Like uptime, well, that's not terribly straightforward, as you'll find out in a couple of slides. But you have to know, like if you have an SLA on help desk, and how many tickets are, and how quickly tickets have to be worked and defects resolved, you actually have to figure out, okay, well, what is the start time of a ticket? When it entered the organization, when it was determined to be a problem, what does correction really mean? Is it when they have a workaround or when they've actually coded the change? So you have to define all of those things, and that takes months and months. It took us 7 months worth of work to get through our 17 LDs. We still have 2 left that have a couple of scenario-based items that we're still working through. You need to be prepared to create a respectful environment. For me, as the leader of the consortium, and Chris Van Vlack, who's my HPE counterpart, we have to lead by example. So when we go into these SLA conversations, Chris and I can't exhibit argumentative behavior or contentious behavior. We have to exhibit and model for our staff that we're in it to figure it out and come to a resolution, that this isn't a win or lose, but rather where do we want to be at the end of the day, which is the best possible service that they can deliver and we can expect with reasonable LDs in the event that it does not occur. That's a hard thing to do, setting up a respectful environment. We actually sort of lectured our staff, not in a really belittling way, but said, look, we're not going into this. We don't want really any arguments. We do want you to roll up your sleeves and figure it out. I also would encourage, if any of you are managing SLAs, I would encourage you to have a policy, which we had to establish, that doesn't allow any of my staff, so we're the customer, we execute the contract on behalf of our 18 counties, so we can get a little demanding. And we can be a little, you know, hey, we're not getting what we think we want, and you're not doing your job. I don't want any of my staff to walk into a meeting and say, well, that's going to be an LD. Because you set yourself up for shutting down that communication and not solving your problem. So my staff are coached not to talk about LDs, not to talk about SLAs. We have places and time and people who do that. That is not them. When I ask for their opinion or I need them to participate because something's gone on where I need their expertise as the operations director or whatever, then I invite them in and they participate in that conversation. And we all know that it's about that conversation, but you don't get to sling it around like mud, because I'll tell you, you'll shut down your communication in your organization quicker than anything by doing that. Anything
Yeah, well, just the fact that Hallie's absolutely right. I mean, LDs are like sledgehammers to the vendor world, right? Everything is costed already. You've already decided how much it's going to cost you and how much you're getting paid, and the difference is your overhead and your profit, right? And so these liquidated damages can just chew away at that profit. Next thing you know, you've got some vice president calling you saying, what in the world is going on? You're not hitting your numbers, and by the way, you're out, right? So, and it forces the vendor side into pulling back and holding within themselves and not necessarily telling you everything that's going on, because they want to make sure that they can address it before, you know, someone starts.
Before we find out.
That's right. Before it starts screaming LD, LD, right? So, so it really is, you know, the situation Hallie's talking about where the relationship is so much better, keeps it more open, keeps it more collegial, and then put the assessment of these things and the determination of the assessment into its own group, into its own view of it.
Right. So I think we can go to the next slide because I think, yeah. This talks a little bit about once you've kind of hashed through what this thing really means and what the scenarios are in which you would apply the SLA, then you have to figure out what tools you're going to use to monitor them. Tools and people and time and all of that good stuff, which could be very onerous on both the customer as well as the vendor. And they have to bake that in their RFP response. Now that we have 17 SLAs, I have 2 full-time dedicated people who manage looking at tickets and uptime and validation. But what we've done is we've created 2 mirror groups. One is our vendor, one is my IV&V vendor we use First Data. These First Data staff, they do the exact same work that HP does not together, but at the same time frames, and then they come together several times a week. If they're like help desk tickets, they may meet frequently. If it's uptime and we haven't had an incident, obviously that there's no need to meet between them, but they meet on a regular basis so that when we get to our monthly SLA meeting, everybody knows if there are any sticking points, what they are and where they are in the process of defining a compromise or a change on one side or the other for the information that we've gathered. I honestly don't want anything escalated to me because it's Chris and myself. We're the tiebreakers. If there's a dispute between our staff and the 17 SLAs and it comes to me, my staff better have gone over it up one side and down the other, and I would like them to compromise with the vendor if it makes sense. I would like them to consider all things that occurred in that month and use their best judgment to say, you know what, Hali, I think that we should maybe split this time, or I think we should start the clock 2 hours later for this reason. Or did we contribute to it, which made it near to impossible for our vendor to be successful? When they come to me with recommendations like that on an escalation item, Chris and I can get through it in a few minutes and have an agreement on what that LD meant for that month. Does that make sense? Anything?
Well, I just want to emphasize, so it says the word monitoring tools there, automation. That's a big key here. You want to see as many ways as you can to automate these processes and then get agreement between the 2 parties what the automation is, and that solves it for you. There's a lot of tools you can use. Agree that the output of that is what you will use to determine whether or not you've made or not the service level that you were
right. In our counties in the RFP, they wanted to know if our vendor was missing any LDs, so they required a dashboard. So they have an executive dashboard out at all the counties that they can watch all 17 LDs and how they're doing throughout the cycle of the month. That's one way of automating output and communication to your whoever it is that your customers or vendors are. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
What tool are you using for that dashboard? Is it Atlassian by chance?
No. Can I get your card? I'll get back to you. All right, that would be good. Yeah, because I don't know. Okay.
All right, so you can see on here there's 7 topics. We're just going to go over them. What are the kind of common SLAs? So I'm not going to read that to you. Okay, uptime example. So uptime in this case, when we talk about the word uptime, we're talking about the system being available for use. So, the first question is where do you measure it? I put a couple examples here. You can measure it the operating system, the server operating system. You measure it the database. You can measure it the application. Recommendation is measured at the application if you can, but you can't always. You really need a tool to do that. You need some sort of script running constantly to tracking the application as if someone
Which
hit.
we have, by the way. Just
there you go.
Saying.
Well, and that's very important, right? It's as if someone hits enter and it tracks the amount of time and it comes back and it records all that data. That's really the best way to do this. If you can't, you can measure it. The server operating system, but the problem is a server operating system could be up and the application could be down, right? Same with the database. A lot of databases, it's real simple. There's tools to measure either the operating system uptime or the database uptime. The problem is that doesn't mean your users are up and using the system. And that you can imagine the kind of contention that causes when you say, nope, the database is up. Well, it doesn't matter. The system's down, right? Or an application's down or a module's down. So where to measure it if you can, application. If not, move it back from there. You know, how to measure it. Again, if you have a tool, you can say the tool on its iteration here, and it goes through an iteration once a minute, it got an error. So, but if you don't, now you're going through help desk tickets. Right, so when did it go down? Somebody reported it down. You can mark that time down. That's a good way to do it. You know, when did it come up? You know, you can all agree. Sometimes you can all agree. Sometimes there are email trails, right? But what we're talking about then is somebody reading all those help desk tickets and all those emails at the end of the month to try to figure out what was the uptime. So, because you got to add up all those downtime minutes. To be able to figure out and just put them in the calculation to figure out if it was actually available to meet your expectations. So
this is an example, if I may.
Yeah.
This is an example where our uptime monitoring, the individuals who are responsible for that from First Aid and HP, they would, as soon as we have an event, they get together and figure out what tools they're going to use. Like, was it an email? Was it a help desk ticket? Was it something we were monitoring? And what is that start time? And they do it around the time of the event, as soon as the crisis is over, obviously. So that you don't wait till the end of the month to try and figure that out, that you have a pretty good beat on, you know, what your time frames are shortly after the event occurs.
And some of the complexities you can run into, you know, was it the whole system down? Was it only one module, one application that was down? You know, one system that was down? Was it only, if you know, in Hali's case, she's got many sites. Was it one site that was down?
27 subsystems, and each one of the subsystems has its own % of the SLA. So if the system's totally down, obviously it's 100%. But if it's eligibility determination for customers out there waiting for CalFresh, if that, that subsystem's down, it's 50% down for the consortium. So we put a % on each and every one of them, and the LDs applied depending upon what subsystems are up and what are down. This is the one last thing that's holding out. Remember I said there's two. There's one subsystem where we don't necessarily agree at the weight of the % of down. We're working it through.
In almost every instance, both parties say that if there's scheduled downtime, of course, that gets subtracted from the total downtime minutes, so that affects the percentage. And then don't forget, you really need to remove what you control, not what the vendor controls, right? So if you're supplying the power, if the servers are on your floor space and you provide the power and your power goes down, well, the vendor's not necessarily responsible for that. And so what they'll do is in these negotiations, they'll say, well, we can't be accountable for that. And that's probably pretty true. You know, HVAC, the same thing. If it gets too hot and the server's all shut down because it's too hot. And by the same token, network, it all depends, right? Sometimes based on your contract, you may provide the network, they may provide the network, it depends. But if you're providing the network, the vendor's going to say, I cannot be accountable for the time in that network because they can't control the latency and they can't control whether the network's up.
Right, and these are the conversations that you want your staff to be well versed in having. You want them to have them on your behalf. The incident does matter. The components of what caused the outage does matter. Talk about them. Figure it out. Be reasonable. This isn't, again, to penalize, but rather to get the service that you expect.
So,
I love this example, by the way.
Yeah, we threw in an uptime chart just so that we talk about realism, right? We talked about realism earlier, so you can see the amount of downtime per month in hours, minutes, or seconds on this right column based upon, you know, and one of the reasons we like this chart is that the 1 9, 2 9s, you can see 3 9s, 4 9s, 5 9s, right? So, you know, 99%, 7.2 hours per month. Okay, well, so but it all depends on you. It depends on what your application is and what you need. And you need to ask for what you need and set your SLA what you need, but be careful about going over. Be careful about getting it too high. So let's go all the way to the extreme, right? to 5 nines, you know, it could only be down 25.9 seconds per month. Okay, that's
Not going to happen.
you probably don't need that. There may not be enough hardware in the world to keep an application up to do that. Applications have to do, you know, hot failover. I mean, they have to be engineered for that kind of thing. In my experience, I see this kind of thing in the switches that run cities, right? In the telephony switches that run cities. They have 5 nines. You know, the PBX world, the large-scale PBX world, they have 5 nines. But for the custom application world, probably not. So don't, I'm not saying don't ask for what you need. Do ask for what you need, but just be careful about going above it.
I'm at 99.5, just so you know. This is a mission-critical application. It does feed people, get their medical services to them, provide them the money they need to pay their rent. So absolutely, it's mission-critical, and we have a very high expectation of 99.5.
Okay, so system response time. Did I mess that up?
No.
No,
I just
uptime
think
example.
it's sort of an add-on to what we've already been talking about.
Yeah, this would be the length of time that it would take for the application to come back for you to measure it, not how long it's been up. Last time we did uptime. This is system response time for the application to come back. You can measure the application or at the database. I did actually mess those up a little bit in my head, so hopefully I didn't mess it up in everybody else's heads also. Yes?
On the chart that you provided, that's given an 8-hour workday.
Actually, that's 7 by 24.
Right.
Okay.
So that's all minutes available in that in a month. Again, we talked about scripting a tool. Don't forget that you can use a stopwatch over somebody's shoulder. Now, it can't work for interplaying into the average in a month, but it works very nicely for showing somebody. And I see it all the time when somebody says, you know, our average is okay, and we'll say, well, let's go out here and actually look at it, and response time could be miserable. So it really does help.
Your customers will tell you that too.
That's right.
If it's miserable, they'll say it is. And stopwatch is actually sometimes the only way you can see how miserable it is. Like in the case of some state systems that are out in counties, like CWS, CMS, that, you know, what about the leg of the journey from the firewall to the workstation and back to the county firewall? It's hard to measure those things and figure out what's real. But you have to figure it out, because if you have one or more counties who are operating really slow, it can be very impactful for their workday. So you've got to have the measurement capabilities.
So in this where to measure, you can measure it in the database. A lot of database tools will do that for you. And of course, you have to remove what the vendor can't control, in this case, like the network. And so you can see why one of the reasons that the topics are so similar between uptime and response time is one of the reasons, because if you run a scripted tool, you can measure both. It'll handle both. It'll handle how long did it take to do that transaction, and then if it takes an error, you're measuring how long it was down. And the same is true with the database can measure whether it was up and available or not, or whether it was actually, and then how long it took within the database. So that's why the two topics are tied a little bit together, and often we use the same tools to measure them.
Absolutely.
Does that make sense? On-site response time. This is an example of there's some equipment out in a remote site, and it needs to be up and running, and the vendor needs to get out there and fix it. So typically the tracking starts when the phone call is placed. Somebody says, you know, such and such is down. The vendor gets out there and starts to they dispatch. You got to pick some kind of a time to be out there. I can tell you in the emergency response world, it can be very short. It'll be 2 hours. They need to be on site within a metropolitan area in 4 hours in a rural area. If you don't need that, don't try to hold them to that, because that'll cost you a lot of money. You know, if it needs to be simply next day repaired, set it up for next day repaired. And they'll get out there in a day and get it out there. This is to be on site. Because, and I put it, we wrote it this way because you can't always say when the repair will be done based upon the complexity of the repair. If it's a simple swap, you can say absolutely, you know, then you could check, you could set an SLA for time to repair. If you can't get all the way to time to repair, at least do a time to on-site, because that gives you the beginnings of the service that you need to be successful. And this is another instance where you're reviewing all the trouble tickets to figure out whether or not whether the SLA was met. So there's a lot of overhead, a lot of management with this SLA. Call answer stats. So this is an example of an outsourced help desk. You've got a vendor who you're saying is answering calls, and they're providing the staff. So you got to make sure that it's answered in an appropriate amount of time, and people are getting what they need, right? So one of the nice things about this is the tool that typically an ACD or a PBX, right, automatic call distribution system, or the exchange system, the telephone system can typically give you the stats that you need pretty much automatically. You can get to the point that you can just run these reports. So examples of things you'd want to track, right? Average call answer time. You know, that's kind of how many rings, you know, before somebody picked it up. Average and the maximum hold time. Right, two different things. You want to make sure that on an average it's good, but you also don't want those outliers sitting there waiting for 5 minutes and not being answered. Another thing a lot of people forget is, so if the vendor says, sure, I'll do that, and they bring in one T1, and that's, you know, 24 simultaneous calls, and then a 25th person calls, there's nothing in the ACD that says somebody else tried to call, because call didn't come in. So the only person who knows that's phone company. So you got to ask the phone company to do a busy study from the switch to let you know that there actually were people that were waiting to get in.
And from our project, we actually have 4 products for CalWin. One of them is a call center network. Now that we're connected with Covered California and the CalHear system, they actually do what many of you may know, warm handoffs to the consortia across the state. We have an obligation or an MOU between the state and our consortium where we need to answer the call within 30 seconds. That can be pretty difficult during open enrollment, or it certainly was the first year. So when the call comes from Covered California, and let's say San Diego is busy, that's one of my counties, our phone system that HP has in place needs to rotate to the next available county, so it's constantly polling all 18 of our counties to see how many calls they have going, how many calls they can take, and if one's coming in for San Diego, they'll reroute it to another county to stay within that SLA and that agreement. It's actually kind of speaks to what you were asking about earlier. When we went into this agreement with Covered California, we had to define what is a reasonable expectation between ourselves and the state. Okay,
so project deliverables. So don't forget, so a lot of the SLAs talking about have been on the operations side, management and or maintenance and operations side. This is talking about SLAs on the project side. So you know, often in a large project you'll require a bunch of large deliverables, whether the project plan, scope plan, comp plan, all those different plans. So you know, often we'll set a deliverable expectation document is due at a certain date. You'll have, based upon the number of pages of it, there'll be a turnaround time that for you to review it, for you to get back to them, for them to make the changes, turnaround time for them to make the changes, and there can be SLAs on all of those times. I can tell you that often we'll set it. So they may produce a 100-page document. Well, you know, we've written these SLAs before where it says, so, you know, if it's we get a day to review for every 5 pages of the length of a document, or 10 pages for the length of a document, so that way you can then say in the contract, here's the date that it's supposed to do first, and then the turnaround from that, and make sure everybody stays on target so that you don't end up with documents that linger for a very long period of time.
And where we took care of this in our new M&O contract was not so much down to the level of change orders and how long you have what document, but rather when our vendor commits to a release for a particular change, that's where we have the SLA. When they say we're going to put it in release X, it better be in release X, which means they have to go through all these functions in order to get there on time. We have internal agreements on who gets what document for how long, but that's how we chose to handle it.
And then just don't forget there's a difference between a cosmetic and a content modification, right? You can approve it conditionally based upon cosmetic changes still outstanding.
Absolutely.
Software development.
Okay, this is another area pain point for us, to be quite honest with you. When HP would deliver code in our last contract into UAT, we would only allow 3 defects per 1,000 lines of code that they were delivering into that UAT cycle. And we even tightened up the SLA further with our M&O contract, because what we want is we want quality code into user acceptance test cycle. User acceptance test is not intended for your customer to find the defects you just coded, right? It's intended for them to get a preview of the code that they just bought. There's a big difference. And so we really have a rather hefty SLA here, because our counties really spent more of their time finding defects and waiting for code corrections than they did on refining their training or their user manuals, which is what they should be doing, or figuring out, is there a business process that changed because this is a big legislative change and now they're delivering it's automated? Do we have to undo a workaround? I mean, just those are the types of operational things that they should be thinking about, not how many defects they found, right? And then release timeliness, target dates. When our vendor says we deliver, 4 times a year and these are the dates, we have agreements around these are the dates. Thou shalt not move. We may move changes through conversations in and out of releases for really good reason, especially those of us who have to code to legislative interpretation. Sometimes late in the game, interpretations emerge. It's really fun when that happens, because then there's a mad scramble on, can we do it or do we have to move it? Because sometimes we just flat out have to move it and it's not the vendor's fault. So those are the conversations. And then deficiency resolution. Boy, do I have a story here. We would carry 15 to 1,800 tickets in our ticketing system at any one time. We'd have a release and we'd get a big influx of 300 to 500 tickets. When that happens, there's more work there than anybody can actually get through to get to the real true problems. So going to this new contract, we not only had to define roles and responsibilities for our counties in promoting tickets, but we also had to have very strict rules about ourselves on how we manage tickets within the organization. So now we carry, after a release, about 400 to 500 tickets, and our standard is around 300 tickets. That's because what's getting promoted up are likely to be defects. They're not questions, they're not concerns, they're not clarifications, which is what our former ticketing system was all about. In addition to that, we also have strict SLAs on if it's a priority 1, then it has to be corrected within the next release cycle, which could be 2 weeks from now. Or if it's a priority 2, it may have 60 days. A priority 3 is 120, and so forth. So you need to give time for them to correct the code. It also depends on how severe the deficiency is and how much it's impacting your customers. So if it's 90% of all my CalFresh recipients and it's a big, big problem, that means the counties have to touch every case physically to do some sort of workaround until that code correct is in. So there really is the give and take and analysis that goes on as to how bad these problems are.
So I know we're right up against the end. We'll cut some of these short here as we finish up.
Is that your way of saying speed it up?
like on this one, we could simply say, don't forget about your batch processing SLAs.
Oh, but there's so much more here. So I have several hundred batch processes that run at night, and because we have that many, and when we took on Covered California clients, we went up 2 million cases, and so the time it took to get through our batch processing, we were hitting the wall where we were not meeting our uptimes. So in our new contract, we have batch processing SLAs and uptimes for our counties. And of course, you can't run batch processes during the daytime. So these things really have to be done. And they're very dependent on the functions that occur for our clients. So yeah, I'll cut that short. Any questions on that at all? No.
just wanted to give you an idea of some things that are problematic. We'll go through it really quickly. So be careful about putting an SLA on workstation uptime, because it's really hard to tell the difference between a workstation that's turned off and a workstation that is not functioning. It's almost impossible to measure. So I've seen that removed before. We talked about how much trouble it is to look through the trouble tickets, that you're generating your downtime from the trouble tickets if you don't have a tool. We talked about measuring response to the database, the problems that can be, and then the uptime from the OS. So we kind of talked about that. So those are just some problems to think about. Sometimes they can't be avoided, but if they can, avoid them.
So this is our recap slide. So we're all the way at recap. So negotiate as much as you can during contract negotiations for clarity. When you get out of contract negotiations, set up your team to define what your SLA scenarios mean to everybody. Figure out who your people are who get to talk about SLAs and when they get to talk about them. Figure out when your escalation occurs and who you're escalating to and what that process is. And make sure that you are leveraging other RFPs that are out there to define your SLAs, and ask for the time that it takes for you to understand. So if you're in the lead of defining an RFP or working on SLAs, reach out to somebody, reach out to me, reach out to other projects that are similar to yours that you're about ready to start, and ask for adequate time to sit down and truly understand what they've done and why they've done it and how they've done it. And then by all means, leverage everything they have, their tools, their anything in writing, you want it. You want it because you can modify it to fit your environment. You don't want to recreate it. That's just a waste of time. And I think, is that our last slide?
One more.
Yeah, I kind of already went through this.
Okay.
And I really don't ever want to talk about SLAs because that means they've escalated to me, and I'd rather they deal with it. Any questions or comments?
I have a quick question.
Sure.
In the unanticipated events, how do you deal with an SLA which nobody thought about it, like a cyber attack or some kind of situation? How do you deal with that? Because
you know, that for us, that can actually occur, has just recently occurred, where you have your contract experts. They begin poring over the contract to find an area where it can be pointed to. I mean, we're good at developing contracts in this state. We've done it for a very long time. There pretty much isn't anything that I can think of that you wouldn't be able to point to an area in the contract that we've had experience in. And then that's when you sit down with your vendor and say, what should we do about this? Based on all we know, what's reasonable, right? Because it really does matter. It's situation based.
That's really where I would go with it. It's the fact that, so if somebody came to me and said, so I'm managing as a vendor a large project, somebody came to me and said, cyber attack, it's your fault, you're down, here's the liquidated damage associated with being down, I'd say, who's responsible for the firewall, right? If it's me, you're right, it's my fault. If it's not, and it was down because of a, denial of service attack through the, from the outside, well, actually I can't be held accountable for something that I'm not in control of. So that it would start with just reasonable discussion about.
Yeah, in our contract we have PII requirements, so anything related to PII has a hefty confidentiality component, so we would be able to manage that because we have talked a lot about confidentiality and attacks. But I also think that's one of the biggest risk areas for a vendor of today. They try and stay one step ahead, but there's somebody out there always a little bit smarter and faster trying to get in and wreak havoc. Anything else? All right, let's go have some lunch. Thank you.
Thank you.